Welcome to Crimes in the Dark, the channel where the most chilling crimes come to life in the dark. Before sleep catches up with you, subscribe and tell me where you're listening to this story from. Now turn off the lights, get comfortable, and let yourself go, because what you are about to hear is real. Case 1. When they found the body, there were still burning embers in the fireplace, as if the killer not only wanted to kill, but to erase. The cabin was isolated, tucked away in the trees north of Seattle, surrounded by fog, damp forest, and the kind of silence not found in cities. Privately owned by Zachary Carter, a reclusive man removed from urban life, barely mentioned at family gatherings. No one imagined that a life would end there. Some hikers saw smoke coming out of the chimney that morning. It was not the busy season. The cabin must have been empty. They approached, they looked out the window, and what they saw changed everything. On the floor, next to a blood-soaked rug, lay the body of Emily Harrison, 18. She wasn't moving. She was not breathing. Her head was propped at an unnatural angle. Blood had dried in a circular pattern around her face. Next to it, a heavy bronze candlestick, fallen, covered with dark stains. The officers arrived in less than an hour. They entered. The scene was cold, tense, untouched. There were no signs of forced entry. The back door was undamaged. The windows were locked from the inside. Everything indicated that the victim knew who killed her. Emily was alone in her uncle's cabin. Her uncle Zachary, her mother's brother. He was no stranger. They'd spent days together before, family vacations, walks in the woods, photos in antique frames. The kind of relationship that doesn't raise suspicion until it does. Forensics found signs of a struggle. Bruises on the arms and torso. Traces of skin under her fingernails. Defensive scratches. Emily had fought, or at least tried to resist. But the most disturbing thing wasn't on her body. It was in the fire. Inside the fireplace, still smoldering, the experts found a partially burned blanket and scraps of paper. They were pages torn from a notebook. Ink smudged, scorched edges, fragments of confessions, crossed out names, dates. Further analysis revealed that they were parts of a personal diary. Emily's. There was no robbery. The wallet was still there, the cell phone manually turned off with no trace of a call for help. And on the ground, dried mud, footprints, the same ones that were later linked to boots found in Emily's father's house, a coincidence that further complicated the case. But there was something else, a strange stillness in Emily's face. She didn't look surprised. She didn't look terrified, just resigned. And that's when Detective Donovan Hale got the call. A young woman murdered in a cabin, a burned diary, a family who claimed to know nothing, and an uncle who, suddenly, had disappeared from the map. And Hale knew well what that meant. When someone kills and then sets the story on fire, it is because he fears that the truth speaks louder than he does. Emily Harrison was 18 years old and had a notebook full of unfinished sentences. She loved to write, not to escape, she said, but to understand. She was a senior at a Seattle public high school, good GPA, little social life, and a folder on her computer titled First Draft Novel. She wanted to be a writer, not just any fiction, but hard-boiled stories, realistic ones, the kind that forces you to look at what no one wants to see. She lived with her parents, Sarah and Charles Harrison, in a residential neighborhood with no surprises. Her mother was an accountant. His father was a motorcycle mechanic. Middle-class family, orderly life. But as is often the case, what you see on the outside doesn't always reflect what's cooking on the inside. Since she was 15, Emily had been in intermittent contact with her maternal uncle, Zachary Carter. Single, childless, with no social networks. He lived apart, in a cabin he inherited and restored himself on the outskirts of Seattle. To some, it was an eccentricism. To Emily, it was a refuge of sorts. Ever since she was a child, she had seen him as someone different. An observer, quiet, mysterious. One of those adults who seem to know things no one says. In recent months, according to the testimony of her teachers and close friends, Emily talked more frequently about him. She said she wanted to interview him, to write about his life. That there were things in her family's past that no one was telling, that Zachary knew them, and that she wanted to understand them and maybe tell them. She had started jotting down loose memories, things her mother would say under her breath when she thought Emily was asleep, disjointed phrases. Don't invoke it. That's all behind me now. Other times, comments about how Zachary had been weird forever. But there were never any concrete accusations, just prolonged silences, voids filled with unspoken suspicions. Emily had asked permission to spend a weekend at her uncle's cabin as part of a personal project. She said she wanted to isolate herself to write. Her parents, though with reservations, agreed. They trusted that the isolation could help her focus. No one imagined it would be the last time they would see her alive. In his backpack, a black-covered notebook, several unsent letters, and a sheet of paper with a single handwritten sentence were found. Sometimes the past is not a place. It's a person who stayed too long in silence. What Emily went looking for that night at the cabin, truth, inspiration, redemption, will never be fully known. But what she found changed everything. Zachary Carter was 38 years old, tall, impeccable, always in a dark suit even at informal gatherings. He was not a man of the people, although he lived in one. He was a real estate entrepreneur who had made his fortune buying up forgotten properties and transforming them into catalog homes. Charismatic, reserved, polite. Everyone knew who he was, no one knew too much. But Emily Harrison, his niece, he did seem to know. Or so he said. When he was summoned to testify, Zachary didn't hesitate. He showed up on time, dressed as usual, with the ownership papers for the cabin in hand and a rehearsed but apparently sincere account. According to him, it had been Emily who had asked for the keys. She said she wanted to spend a weekend alone, get away from the noise, concentrate on her writing. Something about memory, Zachary said. A very personal project. I thought it was brave. He agreed. He gave her the key without consulting her parents. And that, according to her testimony, was the origin of a bigger problem. Charles Harrison, his brother and Emily's father, confronted him for doing so. He said it was inappropriate, that Emily was still a minor, that she could use that isolation as an excuse for other things, drugs, boys, danger. Zachary downplayed it. He said he trusted her, that all Emily wanted to do was write, that she was more mature than her father thought she was. But that didn't calm Charles. He accused him of irresponsibility. He called him an accomplice. The confrontation was brief, according to Zachary, but tense enough to leave a rift between brothers. During the deposition, Zachary insisted that Emily saw him as a silent superhero, someone who had supported her when others did not. He mentioned that she talked about writing about him, of portraying him in her stories as a figure of resilience, as an emotional ally, that she admired him, that she listened to him, and that was something he valued more than he wanted to admit. He said he wasn't at the cabin that night, that he spent the weekend at home alone. No witnesses, no phone calls, no verifiable activity. Police found his phone in airplane mode and with no records during the period of the crime, a digital void that could be routine or a constructed alibi. Zachary showed no discomfort in speaking. He did not stammer. He didn't deflect. But there was something about his story that came across to Hale as too clean, as if he knew what points to touch on, what things to emphasize, what tone to use to sound accurate without sounding defensive. Forensics found his fingerprints in the cabin, yes, but that was logical. It was her property. They also found fibers matching one of her jackets on the couch where Emily was last seen. However, there were no traces of blood on her clothing, no signs of violence, nothing directly incriminating. What caught our attention was something else. Among the burned fragments of Emily's diary, partial sentences were found. One read, "Sometimes silence is not respect. It is fear in disguise." Another, "What he thinks he gives me, he actually takes from me." None mentioned Zachary by name, but the tone was personal, close, haunting. When Hale asked him about the journal, Zachary said he didn't know Emily kept one. But in the same interrogation, 5 minutes later, he called it the black hardcover notebook she always kept. A contradiction he did not correct. Zachary had no criminal record, no reports of misconduct, no complaints. But that wasn't enough, because in Hale's eyes, the real story isn't always hidden in someone's past, but in how they describe themselves when they think they're gaining sympathy from others. To the detective, Zachary Carter was not simply a protective uncle. He was a man accustomed to controlling the narrative, to construct his version of events, to present himself as the one who never breaks, but always holds. And that, in Hale's world, was a dangerous sign. Sarah Harrison was 42 years old, but her eyes carried something older, the look of someone who hadn't slept well for years. who watched the world with more distrust than tenderness. A housewife since the birth of her only daughter, she had built her identity around the role of mother. But over the years, that role became a constant struggle to control the one she most wanted to protect. A struggle that, according to some, was too much like resentment. She was meticulous, orderly, religious without being devout. She had an ironclad routine that she rarely broke. Washing machine in the mornings, kitchen at noon, television in the evenings. Her house was impeccable, as if every object was a defense against internal disorder. Emily, his daughter, had always been different. Creative, sensitive, curious. In Sarah's eyes, she was also disobedient, ungrateful, and in recent years, dangerously independent. From the age of 14, the clashes between the two were constant. What Emily considered expression, Sarah called provocation. What Emily wanted to explore, her mother read as a threat. When questioned, Sarah claimed to have no idea what had happened at the cabin. She said she thought Emily was with her uncle writing, that it was a project, that she approved of it. But her body language said otherwise, the way she rubbed her hands together, the too long pauses, the forced confusion, and something else, the almost clinical way he talked about his daughter. He had a lot of weird ideas lately. I didn't know how to separate what I was living from what I was writing. Sometimes I think she forgot she was a teenager. Donovan Hale took note, not just for what he said, but for what he didn't. There wasn't a single "I miss her," not a tear, not an affectionate phrase, just observations. As if he was talking about a problem that no longer existed. As if somehow he had solved it. Days before the crime, Sarah had accessed Emily's phone, according to her own testimony, out of concern. She had found messages with a tone that alarmed her. Intimate descriptions, fragments of text, ideas for scenes of high sexual content, as she coolly put it. According to Sarah, Emily wasn't writing for entertainment. She was doing it with an intention she considered dangerous. He disliked the content. He called it emotional pornography. He said Emily wanted to experience real things only to write them later. She was offering herself up for the sake of a story, he said. Hale detected that this phrase was not literal, but not innocent either. The conflict between the two had intensified in recent months. Sarah had tried to forbid certain books, control her schedule, impose limits. Emily, for her part, had stopped telling her things. She was spending more time outside. She was becoming more secretive, and, according to her mother, more manipulative. What Sarah didn't know was that Emily was writing about her. In her diary, among fragments recovered from the fire, were phrases like, "I'm not afraid of what he thinks. I fear what he wants me not to be. My mother sees me as an extension of her, not as a person. When he looks at me, it's like he's trying to erase something." In the interview with Hale, Sarah showed a version of herself that did not match the one in those writings. She said that her daughter was unstable, unpredictable, that perhaps she needed help. But at no point did she accept the possibility that it was she who didn't know how to deal with a young girl seeking her own voice. Her alibi was weak. She said that the night of the crime she was watching television with her husband. Neither of them could prove it. There were no calls, no visitors, no active devices to confirm her presence at home. Her husband, Charles, repeated the version without varying a single word, which to Hale seemed less like a coincidence and more like a prior agreement. Sarah's phone registered no activity between 7 p.m. and 3 a.m. She did not move, did not use networks, did not send messages. Her browsing history was empty, too clean, and Hale knew that truly quiet people don't clean up their tracks. Only those who want to appear to. Most disturbing was the absent emotional connection. Sarah spoke of her daughter's murder in a cold tone, as if she were assessing a police event. She didn't seem interested in finding out what happened, but in making sure she wasn't involved. There was no blood on his clothing. No debris was found in his vehicle, but fibers similar to those on the couch in the cabin were found on her coat. She said she visited the site weeks earlier with Emily as part of the preparation, that she had not been back since, that the coat had not been washed. To Hale, Sarah didn't look guilty, but she didn't look innocent either. He might not have committed the crime, but maybe he knew more than he was saying. Or worse, maybe his pressure, his harshness, his unspoken words had pushed his daughter into a night when everything broke. In family crimes, Hale had seen it before. Sometimes the violence begins not with the first blow, but with years of accumulated silence. Sarah Harrison was not arrested, but she was marked for what she didn't say, by what she denied too quickly, for the gap where there should have been pain, and there was only judgment. Charles Harrison was not driven by anger, he was driven by insecurity. At 44, he was a man of routine, a local store manager, dutiful, reserved. His name did not figure in scandals or rumors. He had no enemies. But neither did he have a strong voice in his own house. He was the kind of father who claimed to be present, but didn't know how to connect. The kind of man who stayed silent when things hurt. His relationship with Emily, his only daughter, had been strained for some time. He didn't say it openly, but he felt it. She avoided him, not out of hatred, but something simpler, out of emotional distance, out of misunderstanding, out of not speaking the same language. What was hardest for him to accept was that Emily took refuge in another male figure, his brother-in-law, Zachary Carter, brother of his wife, Sarah, a successful, charismatic, self-sufficient man. Emily felt listened to by him, understood, valued, and that, for Charles, was a dull wound. He wouldn't admit it out loud, but it gnawed at him. Every time his daughter mentioned Zachary with admiration, something in him recoiled. It was like seeing his place as a father taken by another man without having had a chance to defend him. When she learned that Emily had asked for the key to Zachary's cabin to spend a few days alone writing, her reaction was immediate. Distrust, fear. Not so much because of the isolation, but because of the suspicion that she was lying. Charles believed his daughter was seeing someone. Jake Thompson, a schoolmate with whom she had exchanged affectionate messages. He found the text while checking Emily's phone without permission. To him, it all fit. The "I need to write" excuse was a mask. The rest, imagination and prejudice. He did not talk about it. He did not discuss. He just accumulated. Until, on the night of the crime, he decided to go to the cabin. He did not warn anyone. He took his vehicle and drove quietly into the forest. It was late in the afternoon. The road was dark, wet, cold. He parked about 100 meters away. The cabin had light. He stood there inside the car for several minutes. He hesitated. He thought about knocking on the door to demand a conversation, of regaining the control he felt he had lost. But he didn't. He returned home, that was his version. And security cameras from a rural stretch confirmed it. His truck was captured leaving the cabin area shortly after 2 a.m. He did not enter. He did not cross the threshold. But his presence there, his proximity to the scene, was enough to make him a suspect. Investigators found dried mud on his boots, with a composition compatible with the soil around the cabin. His fingerprints were also identified on the brass candlestick, the object used as the murder weapon. According to Charles, he had left them on a previous visit when he helped Zachary clean up and move some valuables. He could not say when exactly. His account was weak, but the police could not prove that the prints were recent, nor that he had touched the gun the night of the crime. His alibi was also flimsy. He claimed to have been at home watching television with his wife, Sarah. Neither of them remembered which program. There were no witnesses, there was no digital activity to support his being at home. It was a void, a digital silence that generated more doubt. However, the key test was the clothing. His coat had no traces of blood on it. His vehicle had no stains. His cell phone, although inactive for hours, registered no signals placing him inside the cabin. And most importantly, there was no direct physical evidence connecting him to the exact time of the murder. Detective Hale, upon questioning him, did not see in Charles a violent personality. He saw a fragile man, repressed, wounded in his paternal pride, but unable to transform that wound into physical aggression. Hale had seen it before. Men who failed emotionally but were unable to cross the line into violence. Charles wept silently during the interview, not when the crime was discussed, but when a sentence from Emily's diary was mentioned. "My father looks for me with his eyes, but he never finds me. He doesn't know how to get to me." That sentence broke him, and Hale understood. Charles was not the killer. He was a confused, frustrated father, overcome by emotional distance. He was close to the scene, yes. He was reckless, yes. But his trip to the cabin was the failed attempt to repair something that was already broken. He did not try to hide it. He didn't lie at all. He admitted to going. He admitted wanting to confront. But he didn't go in, and everything that was found, the mud, the footprints, could be explained without direct incrimination. Charles was officially ruled out as the perpetrator of the crime, not without reservations, but with reasonable certainty. His role was not that of the aggressor. It was that of a man who failed to be heard, who was late to the conversation he should have had years before, and in that absence others spoke for him. Others acted, others killed. Jake Thompson, 20, was one of Emily's schoolmates. A quiet, somewhat introverted young man, he described himself as an observer rather than an active participant. During questioning, Jake adamantly denied being Emily's boyfriend, despite previous insinuations. He said that their relationship was superficial, more of a friendship that had not gone beyond exchanging messages and sharing common interests. He claimed that Emily had not shown him any romantic affection and that they had never discussed a future together. However, when asked about her relationship with Zachary Carter, his tone changed. Jake revealed that Emily had mentioned several times that she had a close relationship with her uncle, something that didn't entirely surprise him, as the young woman seemed to admire him deeply. Zachary was always in her life as a refuge, Jake said, hinting that Emily spent more time with him than with her own father, Charles Harrison. Although he didn't go into detail, Jake made it clear that in their conversations, Emily spoke with great appreciation for Zachary, even revealing that he had been a pivotal figure in her personal and creative development. Jake's twist in his story was significant. He admitted that Emily had told him about her special relationship with Zachary, but never gave any indication that it was inappropriate or out of place. However, the way she referred to him, almost with a tone of unwavering admiration, made Jake uncomfortable. Despite her words, his body language showed slight discomfort, as if he was having trouble accepting what he had discovered about the nature of that relationship. When pressed by Hale, Jake finally admitted that Emily had confided to him that she had planned to write about her relationship with Zachary, although she always mentioned it in a context of creative training or looking for inspiration. However, Detective Hale could sense that the nature of that relationship seemed more complex than Jake was willing to admit. Jake did not appear to have any clear motive for the murder, but his statements opened up a new line of inquiry into the unconventional relationship between Emily and her uncle, suggesting that there was something darker behind the seemingly innocent conversations and behaviors. Although Jake denied involvement in the crime, his testimony raised new questions about the environment in which Emily lived and the family dynamics that, until then, had seemed unrelated to the central conflict in the case. The second interrogation with Zachary Carter was more tense than the first. Hale noticed that Charles Harrison's brother-in-law was no longer the calm and respected man he had shown at first. His account became evasive, and his answers became more guarded when the subject of his relationship with Emily was broached. Zachary, despite his calm facade, began to feel uncomfortable. Hale's direct question about his relationship with Emily was unavoidable. Initially, Zachary tried to downplay it. He said that his bond with Emily had been primarily a mentoring relationship. He had given her emotional support, given her access to the cabin so she could write, but that there was nothing inappropriate between them. He stated that Emily only saw him as a protective uncle. However, Hale's persistence caused the truth to begin to spill out. Finally, Zachary admitted that his relationship with Emily had gone beyond what it should have been. He did not use explicit terms, but it was clear from his answers that what he had described as an emotional and supportive bond had become more physical. Although he avoided speaking in detail, his indirect answers suggested that the relationship had been one of rough sex and control, something that Emily had sought and that he had allowed. Zachary mentioned that Emily had told him of her desire to write about her relationship with him, though without going into detail about the content of what she intended to capture. Writing, he felt, was her way of processing what she was feeling. He also admitted that he had noticed that Emily was starting to feel insecure about everything that had happened between them, especially after the tensions with her mother, Sarah. What really revealed a crack in his story was when Hale asked him if he had been afraid that Emily might reveal their relationship. Zachary hesitated, but finally confessed that he feared Emily would talk about everything, especially after she mentioned to him that she wanted to end the relationship because of the pressure she felt from her family and the guilt she carried around from what she had done. As Hale pressed him, Zachary admitted that he had been with Emily the night of the murder. He said she asked him to leave, that she wanted to be alone to write. He insisted that he respected her desire to be alone, but the story didn't quite fit the evidence found at the scene. Zachary's fingerprints in Emily's partially burned diary suggested that he had been involved in some way in the events of that night. Zachary stated that he left the cabin around midnight, but was unable to provide solid details of his whereabouts after leaving. Emily's bewilderment, her inner turmoil about her relationship with her uncle, and family difficulties may have been the factors that led to a final confrontation. Zachary became increasingly nervous as the interrogation progressed. Although he denied murdering Emily, his inappropriate relationship, his fear that it would be revealed, and the inconsistent details in his statement placed him at the center of the case. After several weeks of investigation and confrontation, Detective Donovan Hale pieced together a timeline that finally unraveled the details of Emily Harrison's murder. The key piece in solving the case was the confession of Charles Harrison, Emily's father. On the night of the crime, Charles Harrison arrived at the cabin of his brother-in-law, Zachary Carter, in search of his daughter. He had received a call from Sarah, his wife, concerned about Emily's disappearance and the strange situation she had noticed over the past few days. Charles suspected that Emily was with Jake Thompson, her supposed boyfriend, and that they were using the cabin as a retreat to spend some time alone. However, when Charles arrived and looked out the window, what he saw left him completely paralyzed. Inside the cabin, Emily and Zachary were engaged in an intimate scene. Emily was performing fellatio on her uncle. Charles watched this from the window, unaware of their presence. The emotional impact was immediate and devastating for him. He felt betrayed, confused, and overcome with anger. In his mind, what he had discovered was not only a violation of family trust, but a direct threat to what he considered his role in the family. As Charles entered the cabin, fury blinded him. The conversation with Emily became tense and violent. He demanded explanations, trying to understand what was going on. But instead of finding answers, he found a confused and doubtful young woman. According to Charles, Emily tried to defend herself, but her anger grew out of control. The argument escalated quickly, and in a fit of rage, she pushed her daughter. Emily fell backwards, hitting the brass candlestick near the fireplace. The blow was fatal. The head wound was instantaneous and caused Emily's immediate death. The scene was sealed with an absurd and swift violence that shocked Charles as much as the magnitude of his own actions. Upon realizing what he had done, Charles panicked. Instead of seeking help or calling the police, he tried to cover his tracks. He burned the blanket that had been used by Emily and part of her personal diary, which contained details about her secret relationship with Zachary. The burning was not complete, but it was damaging enough to destroy much of the key evidence. However, in his attempt to conceal the truth, Charles made several mistakes. Despite his efforts, he left enough physical traces that linked him directly to the crime scene. Charles's fingerprint was found on the brass candlestick, the murder weapon. In addition, the mud on his boots matched the terrain of the cabin, evidencing his presence at the scene. Charles Harrison's confession revealed his emotional motivation. It was an impulsive act born out of a mixture of jealousy, anger, and frustration. The discovery of the inappropriate relationship between Emily and Zachary, coupled with his own internal conflicts, caused the situation to spiral out of control. It was not premeditated, but the result of an explosion of unresolved emotions. Although Zachary Carter was not directly responsible for the murder, his relationship with Emily and his role as a central figure in the events of that night cannot be ignored. However, it was Charles who acted alone, driven by a desire to control what he perceived as a threat to his authority and his vision of family. Ultimately, the case closed with the sentencing of Charles Harrison for manslaughter. Although the evidence did not suggest premeditation, his violent behavior and the cover-up of the crime placed him as the direct culprit. The Harrison family, now broken by grief and betrayal, was left scarred by secrets and unresolved silences. Case 2. The body of Sister Caroline Hughes was found one cold September morning in the confessional of St. Andrew's Abbey Church in Brookville, Idaho. The find came not by chance, but by routine. The sexton, a young volunteer who opened the church each day at 6 o'clock sharp, was the one who found her. He didn't scream. He did not approach. He just ran into the street, white as a sheet, and called 911 from the phone of a neighboring store. In less than 20 minutes, the scene was cordoned off. He was the first to arrive. Detective Marshall Everett did not believe in God, but he respected the silence of churches. When he walked through the doors of St. Andrew's, he didn't speak. He didn't wave. He asked no questions. He just walked toward the confessional with slow steps, as if the air there was heavier than usual. He was 52 years old, with tired eyes and a worn leather jacket that looked like part of his skin. He had been in homicide longer than he could remember. He'd seen bodies split in the middle of the highway, women hanging from rafters, children in frozen rivers. But this was different. Sister Caroline was kneeling, as if in prayer. The rosary hanging from her neck was wrapped violently around her wrists, binding them behind her back. The crucifix, large antique metal, had been embedded in her chest with surgical force. There was no visible disarray in his clothing, no sign of struggle, only his face still with half-closed eyes and a barely perceptible grimace of restrained pain. Everett bent down. He touched nothing. He just watched. On the kneeler, a sheet of thick paper written in black ink. A single word, centered, as if written with religious precision. Repent. There was no signature, there was no more. The whole church was silent, but not at peace. Something there was vibrating, like a taut rope about to break. The detective did not believe in supernatural things, but he had learned to read the air. And the air at St. Andrew's was polluted. He walked to the parish office. There, the files were in complete disarray. Folders opened, sheets torn out, some trampled on the floor. No money was missing. No valuables were missing. The thief, if he could be called that, had been looking for something very specific. Something that perhaps he did not find, or that he did find and left no trace. On the floor between the pews of the church, there were wax stains forming an irregular pattern. It was no coincidence. To one side, an open prayer book on a page about penance. Some phrases were underlined in red, as if someone had wanted them to be read aloud. The mass chalice, found a few feet from the body, contained a mixture of dried wine and hardened wax. Inside, partial fingerprints, just enough to confuse, just enough to leave intrigue. Marshal Everett was silent for several minutes. He took a cigar out of his pocket. He twirled it between his fingers, not lighting it. It had been 6 years since he had smoked, but he needed it to think, to get the pieces, still loose and slimy, to start moving. Brookville was a town of barely 10,000 people. The church was the heart of the community. For a murder to be committed there, inside the confessional, and with that level of symbolic brutality, was no ordinary crime. It was a message, and he knew it. Because Marshall had seen messages before, some coded, others screamed in blood. This was not just any murder. It was an execution, a settling of scores, not against a person, but against what she represented. And that was just the beginning. Marshal Everett knew that all crime begins with the victim, not with the killer, not with the clues, with the person who stopped breathing, with who he was, with what he kept quiet about, with what he hid so well that no one realized he was in danger. Sister Caroline Hughes, 32 years old, nun of the Order of the Sisters of Eternal Grace, entered the convent at 18. She had no husband, no children. Her record was clean, her story seemingly simple. A religious vocation from a young age, a life of charity, an absolute commitment to the most vulnerable in Brookville. She was known to all as a generous soul, an incorruptible figure. In the eyes of the community, she was practically a saint, but no one is a real saint. Marshall started with his room inside the church annex building, bare walls, perfectly laid bed, cross over the headboard, not a family photo, not a personal ornament, just a Bible, an antique wristwatch, and a brown leather-bound notebook, closed with a gray cloth ribbon. He leafed through it with gloves, tight, steady letters, dates in order. No entry too long, but all written with intensity. It was a diary, personal, intimate. Each page revealed more than any witness could have said. There were no names, there were no direct confessions, but there was a truth growing between the lines. Caroline was not as stable as everyone believed. For almost a year, he had been registering deep doubts, silent ones, phrases that spoke of loneliness, of unanswered questions, of disappointments within his own order. There was one word that kept repeating itself, though it was never fully explained: shame. And next to it, an expression that appeared 5 times on different pages: what was hidden will come to light. Each time written with greater pressure in the ink, as if over time her fear became more physical, more desperate. Everett could read silences, and that notebook spoke more in what it didn't say. It named no one, it didn't point fingers, but it left a dense feeling like standing water, as if Caroline had been carrying something gnawing at her from the inside. Something she had tried to purge by praying, but it hadn't worked. In the community, the responses were predictable. Everyone described her as pious, kind, without enemies. A woman of God, they repeated. A guide, they said. But that didn't help the detective. He looked for cracks, places where the truth escapes. Sister Caroline had requested a transfer weeks earlier. The request was not accepted. There were no official reasons, just a note from the local bishop saying that her presence was essential to the spiritual stability of the community. That expression, spiritual stability, sounded to Marshall like a decorated way of saying, there is something that cannot yet be known. No unusual financial movements, no indication of blackmail, but a list of frequent visitors, people who came to see her outside of confession hours. Some ex-cons, people in halfway house programs, teenagers from troubled homes. Nothing illegal. But the pattern was clear. She worked with people the rest of the town preferred to keep at a distance. There was also the detail of the parish archive. This was no random ransacking. Looking through the folders, Marshall noticed that many had to do with old records of private donations, adoptions, and activities not officially reported by the diocese. Some files were uprooted, not stolen, destroyed, as if someone didn't want certain stories to ever be told. He returned to the confessional in the evening, alone. He wanted to see the scene without the hustle and bustle of forensics or the echo of murmurs. He closed his eyes for a moment. In his mind, the word repent kept vibrating with a dry rhythm. Sharp. It was not a plea. It was a condemnation. Sister Caroline Hughes had died in silence, bound with the symbols of her faith, murdered in the place where others confessed their sins. But the question that mattered was this: what sins did she bear? And more importantly, who decided that he did not deserve acquittal? Father Samuel Brooks' name was the first to appear in Marshall Everett's notebook. Not because of a direct lead, not because of a specific accusation, but because of his proximity to the epicenter. He was the only other permanent resident of St. Andrew's Abbey, the only one who shared the same roof, the same hallways, and the same silence with Sister Caroline Hughes, day after day, night after night. Two souls locked in an old, dank, echoing structure, with no other company than the smell of melted wax and the whispers of the past. Brooks was 45 years old. He had arrived from Oregon just over 2 years earlier, sent by the diocese after a sudden pastoral relocation that no one fully explained. Serene in appearance, soft-spoken and commanding in presence, he quickly became a central figure in the community. His sermons were precise, emotional, with a hypnotic rhythm that drew crowds every Sunday. The people adored him, women respected him. The men listened to him, and children saw him as a living saint. But Everett knew well that the most convincing masks are the ones that don't look like costumes. In his personal life, Father Brooks was a mystery. He did not leave the compound much. He was occasionally seen at the market or the local pharmacy. He had no social networks, no known family. He lived with rigorous discipline. His desk was always tidy. His books were arranged by author and year. Everything indicated a meticulous, restrained, almost obsessive control freak. But beneath that facade, the detective sensed an invisible tension. Something unresolved, something repressed for too long. Sister Caroline's autopsy revealed that she had died between 2 and 3 a.m. At that time, according to his statement, Father Brooks was in his office, preparing the Sunday sermon. He had no witnesses. The door was locked. No one else was awake. No footsteps were heard. No lights were turned on. But what really caught Everett's attention was a simple detail. The priest's cassock, still hanging behind the office door, had wax stains on the bottom edge. The same kind of wax that had been found on the floor near the confessional, melted into irregular patterns that the coroner was still trying to interpret. Father Brooks did not deny the coincidence. He stated that he had been using candles during the night as part of a personal meditation, something he said he did regularly, but his body language said otherwise. Rapid blinking, restrained breathing, still hands, too still. Everett didn't need a confession to know something was hiding under that perfectly folded cassock. The real crack appeared 2 days later when the confessional was authorized for inspection. Hidden inside the bottom drawer, wrapped in linen cloth, they found a small metal box. Inside, a handwritten letter from Brooks himself, a letter addressed to God, or rather to himself. It was not an official document. It was an outburst, a private confession. There, the priest recounted, without naming her directly, a prolonged temptation, a forbidden connection with a sister who shared his vocation. He spoke of nights of doubt, of conversations that went on too long, of silences too intense, and of a single moment when, he said, they crossed the line. He didn't detail how or when. He only mentioned that after that, Caroline withdrew emotionally, that she became more reserved, more anxious, and that he began to fear her secret would come out. Everett then realized that the root of the murder might be buried more in the emotional than the material. that the motive was not money, not revenge, but guilt. And that guilt had a face, voice, and a cassock stained with wax. The letter alone did not make him guilty, but it humanized him. It disarmed him. It showed him as a man caught between desire and devotion, between the sacred and the carnal. And more importantly, as someone who had reason to silence Caroline. If she had decided to confess what had happened, if she had thought about leaving the order, if she planned to report what happened that night, then Brooks had reason to act, or to fear that someone else would act. On formal cross-examination, his stance was firm. He said that he had loved Caroline in a way he should never have felt, that they both knew it, that it was a mistake, and that they had promised each other never to mention it again. He assured that he would never hurt her, that he still prayed for her soul. But his gaze trembled as he was shown the word written in black ink, repent. He didn't know what to say. She didn't know if it was a threat or a mirror. Several parishioners confirmed that weeks before the murder, they had seen Caroline crying in the back garden of the church. Others said that she and the father argued quietly, but without shouting, on at least 3 occasions. A young volunteer claimed to have seen them leaving the south wing of the building together after midnight. None of the evidence was conclusive, but it all pointed in the same direction. There was tension. There was a history. And there was something broken between them that never quite healed. The priest's alibi was finally disproved by the forensic evidence. The wax stains matched in composition and temperature those at the crime scene. In addition, further analysis revealed traces of fibers from Caroline's habit on the inner sleeve of the cassock, something that should not have been there if, as he claimed, he had not seen her that night. However, no direct prints were found. There was no blood on his clothing. There were no records of him leaving or entering the confessional during the hours of death. He was a strong suspect, but not definite. Marshal Everett didn't write him off, but he didn't lock him up either. He knew that the most twisted crimes were not always committed by the most obvious culprits, and in a place where faith is intertwined with repression, the truth is often darker than the sin. Father Samuel Brooks was, in many ways, the perfect image of what Caroline may have wanted to escape. A man caught between duty and desire, between salvation and punishment. Michael Hughes was not an easy man to read. His face seemed carved by the country wind, with deep wrinkles around his eyes, and a look hardened by years of silence. His arrival in Brookville weeks before the murder went almost unnoticed. He visited no one. He did not introduce himself to the community. He checked into a modest motel on the outskirts of town, asked for a windowless room, and paid cash up front. He was spotted at a bar, the hardware store, and a couple of gas stations. Always alone, always distant. As if he was waiting for something or someone. He was Caroline's older brother, the only blood link that the nun kept with her past. A past that she, since the age of 18, had tried to bury under vows of chastity, silence, and obedience. But family ties are not broken by divine decree. They only rot slowly until someone decides to cut them. Michael and Caroline grew up on the outskirts of Coeur d'Alene, on a farm where religion served more to justify punishment than to comfort. He, 5 years older, took on responsibilities as a child. Hard work, early loss, and an education forced by necessity rather than conviction. When Caroline decided to take the habits and give herself to a spiritual life, Michael felt it as a betrayal. Not only did she abandon the home, she also abandoned him. He never fully forgave her. The conflicts between the two were not secret. They argued over the inheritance of their parents' house, over the sale of a plot of land that Caroline refused to sign, over the feeling that she had chosen a clean life, while he remained tied to the earth, to the mud, to ruin. The relationship cooled until it was reduced to sporadic letters that were never answered, calls hung up before the second ring, and long silences full of unsaid things. But something brought him to Brookville, and that something coincided with the last weeks of his sister's life. Marshal Everett found him through a motel search and a witness sheet from the Rusty Nail Bar. On the night of the murder, Michael was there from just before midnight until well after dawn. He drank alone, caused no trouble, and left just as dawn was breaking. Several regulars saw him. The bartender recognized him. There were cameras confirming his entry and exit. The alibi was solid, but Everett wasn't just looking for presence or absence. He was looking for motives, and Michael had plenty of them. He had anger accumulated for decades, a dense and resentful feeling hidden under short sentences and elusive looks. I had unresolved frustrations, unmourned losses. A sister who, from his perspective, left him alone at the worst stage of his life. And above all, he had a broken bond that he had felt raw again when he learned that she was in the same town, that they breathed the same air, that they walked the same streets without recognizing each other. Michael himself admitted that he knew where Caroline lived, that he had walked past St. Andrew's Abbey several times, that he thought about looking for her, about talking, but that he did not. He said there was nothing more to say, that what was past, but the expression on his face said otherwise. It said that there were words that were never said, and that perhaps there was no way to say them anymore without breaking something. What didn't fit for Marshall was the method. Caroline's murder was not impulsive. It was ceremonial, precise, with carefully organized symbolic elements. The posture of the body, the rosary as a binding, the crucifix as a weapon, the handwritten note, it all looked like the work of someone with deep religious knowledge, with an obsession for penance, for sacred punishment. Michael, on the other hand, was a dry man. Rough hands and direct logic. If he had wanted to hurt her, it would probably have been in a more brutal way, more physical, without so much staging. And yet that difference could also be a disguise. Perhaps the crime was designed precisely to divert suspicion, to make people think that he was a fanatic, a religious purist, and not a man from the country, with a shirt stained with sweat and a life full of unresolved grievances. Marshall considered that possibility, that Michael had planned the murder to make it look like something else, that he had done his research, that he had studied the liturgical customs, the symbols, the sacred objects, just to construct a scene that didn't point to him. But all that required time, and patience, and coldness, things that did not quite match the profile of the suspect. Moreover, the physical evidence did not incriminate him. No prints of his were found in the church, no trace of DNA, no indication that he had been there. Not at the scene, not that night. And yet, the feeling persisted that his presence was more than a coincidence, that he had not come just to drink, that his return to Brookville had a purpose he had not yet revealed. Michael Hughes was questioned, booked, and released. There were no elements to arrest him, no evidence directly linking him, but Marshall didn't rule it out. Because sometimes the real crime is not the murder, but the abandonment, the wound that doesn't heal, the word that is never spoken, the forgiveness that never comes. And in the depths of his intuition, the detective felt that Michael, even without having touched Caroline that night, had contributed to her death. Lucy Carter's name came up by accident during a round of interviews with regular parishioners at St. Andrew's Abbey. One of the older sisters in charge of cleaning the East Wing mentioned her as that new teacher who always stayed too long talking to Father Samuel. At first, she didn't seem relevant, just another visitor. But Marshall Everett learned over time that new faces in small towns are almost never completely new. Lucy Carter was 28 years old. She had just arrived from Spokane, Washington. She had been hired to teach literature at the local high school. Her employment record was clean, her arrival in town quiet. She had no record. She had no family nearby. She didn't seem to have any history with anyone, until the names began to intertwine. Lucy was devout. So said those who saw her at Mass. She was always seated in the front row. She arrived before everyone else. She stayed after everyone else left. She would stare at the altar. She would kneel with strength, as if seeking not only faith but refuge, or something he couldn't quite find. What he did find, it seems, was attention, and not from just anyone, but from Father Samuel Brooks himself. Security cameras outside the church, installed in a partial corner of the back porch, caught Lucy coming and going outside the usual hours. Sometimes at night, sometimes before dawn. Always alone. Always when the church was already empty. There was no crime in that. But there was a pattern. Marshall interviewed her at school. She was friendly, open, but shaky. The conversation soon veered toward church. She spoke of her faith with fervor, almost with need. She said she had found in St. Andrew's a place of peace and in Father Brooks a guide. But then he wavered. He changed pace. His words became less careful, more personal. He said that sometimes faith takes you to uncertain places, that the soul seeks things that the body confuses. He did not explain further, until he did. He said that yes, he had had a special connection with Samuel, that she had felt something reciprocal, that there had been moments brief but intense where she believed he was willing to give up the vows too, that he looked at her like no one else. that she could feel it. Marshall let him speak, without interrupting, because the most telling thing was not what he said, but how he said it. Lucy was not in control of her emotions. She was impulsive, sensitive, and had a way of expressing her pain that bordered on obsession. Then he talked about Caroline. He said that the night of the crime he was in the church, that he witnessed an argument between Father Samuel and Sister Caroline, that he did not hear everything, but that there were harsh words and palpable tension, that Caroline was hurt, that Samuel was trying to calm her down, that the atmosphere was unbearable, and that at some point she felt like an intruder, an invisible third figure between two people who couldn't see her. She said she felt ridiculous, used, that she had thought she was special, that her presence in Samuel's life meant something, that maybe he would even give up his habits for her. But that night, seeing them together, she understood that she wasn't unique, that he had another life, another story, an older story, deeper. And then he left. That's what he claimed, that she left the church right after the discussion, that she walked home alone in the rain, that she didn't talk to anyone, that she saw nothing else, that she did not return. He had no witnesses, no one could confirm his presence or his removal. There were no call records either. There were no messages, just her, and the night, and a sea of unresolved emotions. What was disturbing was his language, not the verbal but the emotional, the way he referred to Caroline, with soft words, but with an underlying tone of resentment, as if he considered her a rival, an unfair presence, an obstacle in a story he believed belonged to her alone. No physical evidence linking Lucy to the crime scene was found. There were no fingerprints, there was no DNA, there were no items of hers in the church. But the emotional charge was there, the jealousy, the disappointment, the loss of an illusion, and above all, the feeling of having been invisible. Marshall knew that there are crimes committed with hands and others with desire, that not all murderers are stained with blood, some only push with words, with absences, with emotional betrayals. But he also knew that emotional instability can cause a person to break boundaries even without planning it. The possibility that Lucy had followed Caroline that night, that she had listened more than she should have, that she had acted on impulse, feeling betrayed, that she had picked up a crucifix and nailed it down in anger and sadness. All that was on the table, but without proof it was still just a shadow. Marshall kept her under observation. He kept her going. He waited. Nothing strange came up. She didn't run away. He didn't erase her nets, he didn't change his routines, but something in the way he looked, a mixture of guilt and melancholy, stuck in his memory. Lucy Carter was the kind of person who didn't always know what she was capable of, and in that town shrouded in faith and repression, that made her a real suspect. Because in a town like Brookville, the emotional doesn't vent. It rots, until it becomes action. The truth did not come with a shout, nor with a dramatic twist. It came in the form of a long sigh, held back for weeks, when Father Samuel Brooks, exhausted by his own reflection, asked to speak to Marshall Everett outside the official setting. It was not a negotiation, nor a legal strategy. It was surrender. A silent way to get the weight off his shoulders because the body holds out, but guilt is unforgiving. Samuel confessed to the murder of Sister Caroline Hughes with the voice of one who no longer seeks redemption, but rest. He said that yes, he had been in a relationship with her, that what began as a spiritual connection, a mutual support in the midst of monastic routine, slowly morphed into something more, that the nightly confessions, the sustained glances, the shared prayers, had derived into an intimacy that neither of them knew how to stop in time. Caroline was strong, he said, but she was also broken. So was he. They both carried old wounds, with scars that would not heal with psalms or incense. In those cold, silent walls, they were just two human beings clinging to each other, and at some point they lost control. Caroline was the one who wanted to put an end to everything. She was the one who proposed to confess, talk to the superiors, to take the consequences. Samuel refused. He was afraid, not of ecclesiastical punishment, but of scandal, of losing his place, his image, his last structure. That night they argued in the office for more than an hour. The words became louder. Caroline firm, Samuel desperate. She accused him of cowardice, of hiding behind his cassock, of loving his position more than her. And then she said it. She was going to reveal everything, with or without his consent. The next thing happened fast, too fast. Samuel followed her to the west wing of the church. She entered the confessional, perhaps to pray, maybe to prepare herself. He didn't think about it, he just felt anger, fear, loss. He went in after her. He carried a large altar crucifix in his hands. It was not a weapon, it was a symbol. But it became something else. He hit her. Once, then another. The metal sank into Caroline's chest with a dry sound. She didn't scream. She just fell to her knees as if the pain had forced her to pray one last time. The rest was scenery. Samuel knew he could not disappear the body, nor could he fake an accident. So he devised a more complex lie. He tied Caroline's hands with his own rosary, wrapping the beads in the form of penance. He arranged her in a praying position, her head bent forward. He placed the crucifix still embedded in her body as an act of martyrdom. She lit candles. He let the wax drip in strategic places, creating ambiguous patterns, like symbols of some dark ritual. He opened a prayer book and placed it on the penance page. He tore a white sheet of paper and wrote in black ink a single word: repent. That word was not a plea. It was a shield. A desperate attempt to divert attention, to sow confusion, to make people believe that this was the work of a fanatic, of someone with a cause, not a frightened man who had killed the only person who had ever really known him. The wax stains that accidentally stuck to his cassock during the staging were what gave him away. A minor oversight, but enough. The experts linked it to the scene, the fibers, the composition, the temperature of the hardened wax. Everything fit. And even more so when the personal letters, the cameras, the crossed agendas were reviewed. The truth was there, from the beginning. It just needed to be heard. Samuel's confession was not theatrical. It was slow, precise, as if each word tore out a piece of his soul. He did not cry. He did not beg for forgiveness. She only admitted the facts with the resignation of one who no longer has anything to lose. He said he was not a monster, that he hadn't planned it, that he only wanted to stop her. But he did not measure the force. He did not control his fear, and he ended up doing what he feared most. Marshall Everett did not react immediately. He just nodded. To close his notebook, to look at the man in front of him, a priest, a lover, a murderer, and perhaps deep down a distorted reflection of all the sins the church had been trying to bury for decades. The truth in the end did not redeem anyone. It only exposed human frailty, the weight of poorly made decisions, and the brutal way in which faith can be deformed when it is confused with need. The trial of Father Samuel Brooks was brief but devastating. The confession, forensic evidence, and testimony built an irrefutable case. There was no public outrage, only a tense silence that hung over Brookville like a thick cloud. He was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the judge read the sentence, Samuel's face showed no remorse, only exhaustion. In the courtroom, no one cried, no one celebrated. Justice in that instant did not bring peace. It only confirmed what many already knew deep down, that even within the most sacred walls, darkness can find a place to hide and flourish. Case 3, on September 17th in Wexford, Pennsylvania. What was supposed to be a night of games, costumes, and fantasy ended up revealing a truth buried beneath layers of moisture and concrete. During an unofficial activity linked to the FantasyCon convention, a subway expedition organized by medieval role-playing enthusiasts, a group of participants wandered into a forgotten section of the sewer system. It was part of the allure, getting lost in the unknown, pretending to be someone else, embracing the mystery for a few hours. But the mystery that night was real. More than 30 meters underground, between dark passages and fungus-covered walls, one of the assistants stumbled upon something that shouldn't have been there. At first glance, it looked like a pile of old blankets, but the smell, it was different. Under a layer of cloth soaked by the seepage lay the body of a woman. She was in an advanced state of decomposition. Her face had been almost completely eroded by time and moisture, unrecognizable. But her attire, an elaborate warrior costume, remained largely intact. Among the synthetic leather straps and decorative metal pieces, her left hand stood out. On it, a tattooed symbol, an 8-pointed star pierced by a dagger. It was an unofficial design, associated with a select collective within the FantasyCon community, used in past editions. The connection to the event was clear, but nothing else was. When the police arrived on the scene, they immediately sealed off the entrances. The scene, despite the improvised setting, revealed a clear intention: concealment. The body had not been placed to be found. It had been hidden, withdrawn from the world. Someone had wanted it off the map, and they had succeeded, for a while. The case was assigned to Detective Donovan Hale, a familiar name on the fringes of justice, a man of long silences, eyes that registered everything, and an instinct honed after decades of chasing the invisible. 53 years old, 2 divorces, no children, 0 patience for games. His specialty was not finding culprits, but listening to the things no one was saying. For him, crime did not begin in blood, but much earlier in oblivion. When Hale descended into the tunnel, he found no theatrics. There was no signature. There was no message, just silence. And that, to him, was the most dangerous thing. For he who kills without wanting to be seen rarely leaves room for second chances. The body was removed with extreme caution. Every inch of cloth adhering to the decomposing skin was documented. The subterranean environment had accelerated some biological processes and slowed others. The constant humidity and lack of natural light had created a perfect capsule to preserve oblivion. What was once a carefully designed costume, fine embroidery, metallic details, handcrafted shoulder pads, now looked like a second skin over death. The head, tilted slightly to one side, showed severe structural damage at the base of the skull. The occipital bone was fragmented. To the naked eye, it appeared to be the result of a single, firm, intentional blow. There was no sign of a struggle, no defenses, no immediate signs of sexual assault. Just a clean, silent, effective impact, like someone who knows exactly what he is looking for. The preliminary autopsy confirmed what Hale already suspected. The cause of death had been blunt head trauma. What he could not immediately determine was how long the body had been there. The estimate ranged from 3 to 5 weeks, depending on the microclimate in that section of the tunnel. What was most disturbing was not the blow, or even the decision to hide the body down there. It was the absence of a report. No one had reported her missing. No calls, no relatives, no active search. For weeks, her absence set off no alarm bells. To Detective Hale, that said more than any physical evidence. After analysis of partial prints and comparison with records of frequent Fantasycon attendees, the victim was identified as Kendra Thompson, approximately 30 years old. No immediate family registered in the state, dedicated full-time to the world of cosplay. She was well known on the convention circuit, where she not only participated in contests and photo shoots, but also traded collectibles. Replicas of movie weapons, rare action figures, illustrations signed by cult artists. His presence was commonplace, his face recognized, but his world closed. She lived alone in a one-room apartment on the east side of Wexford. The walls of the place were lined with shelves of meticulously organized pieces, everything from science fiction helmets to hand-carved elven daggers. Everything in his home seemed to be part of a character or many, a life put together like a gallery of masks. Her calendar was full of event dates, themed fairs, order shipments, but the last fortnight was empty. Nothing pointed to a voluntary departure. There were no notes. There were no signs of leakage, just an abrupt break in the routine of someone who, out of habit, documented everything. Hale examined every corner of the apartment. He found no traces of violence or signs of forced entry. The locks were intact. The password-protected laptop was turned over to the cybercrime team. The only thing out of place was a box, still unopened, with the logo of an online vintage store. The receipt, dated 3 weeks earlier, listed the buyer's name, Kendra. But the shipment had been sent to a different address, one that Hale immediately recognized as a residence shared by other regular members of the Fantasycon circuit. It was a clue. Not enough, but firm enough to know that Kendra's death was no accident, no spontaneous disappearance. Someone had meant for her to vanish. Not as a tragic figure in a story of dark magic, but as a real, quiet person, wiped off the map with surgical precision. The tragedy was not just his death, but the way no one noticed. The way that, in a world of costumes and public celebrations, someone could disappear, without anyone asking questions. The message was inside the mailbox, hidden among flyers and overdue mail. It was a piece of paper torn in half, written in thick ink, in a calligraphy that denoted haste or restrained fury. The sentence was clear, blunt. "You have 3 days. I want that sword." It bore no signature. There was no return address. But to Detective Donovan Hale, that message was more telling than any testimony. It was the first thing that caught her attention as she checked the building where Kendra lived. It hadn't been picked up. It was there, amidst the damp and dust. a direct reminder that the victim had been pressed. Someone was looking for her. Someone wanted something she had. Hale knew a threat like that didn't just appear on its own. He looked for a history. He found a pattern. Maria Bellamy's name came up amid reports of altercations at previous conventions, cross-claims, internal complaints, witnesses to public shouting and accusations. Kendra and Maria had been rivals. That was a fact. Both moved in the same circle of collectors and dealers of cult objects. But Maria had a more volatile reputation, more intense. She wasn't just fanatical, she was territorial. And she was obsessed with one piece in particular, a sword used in the movie The Crimson Citadel, an original replica, one of the few in existence which, Hale discovered, had been in Kendra's possession for the past few months. Citing her was a logical step, and urgent. Maria Bellamy, 38 years old, single, no criminal record, but with several formal complaints of aggressive behavior in public settings. Engaged in private collecting of antique weaponry and movie props. Lived in a large house on the outskirts of Pittsburgh. His home resembled a museum closed to the public. Weapons in glass cases, shelves with sealed figurines, documentation classified by origin and authenticity. Everything under lock and key. Everything carefully inventoried. Nothing was decorative. Everything had history, value, obsession. Throughout the interrogation, Hale kept his tone neutral. He knew that pressing her would only arouse resistance. Maria did not deny authorship of the message. She said that yes, she had written it, that she had left it personally, that she had been furious, that she had reasons. According to her story, the sword was not only a collector's item, it was for her an outstanding debt. Years ago, she had participated in an unofficial auction, informal. The object had been withdrawn without explanation before the bidding closed. Since then, she lost track of it, until it turned up in Kendra's hands. Learning that infuriated her, not only because she had lost it, but because whoever had it now was, in her words, a traitor who didn't value what she owned. Maria believed that Kendra was planning to sell the sword in secret, that she was in negotiations with private buyers, that she had no right. It was that conviction that led her to leave the message. It demanded the return. It was not a request, it was an order. But she denied crossing another line. He said he hadn't seen her for weeks, that he hadn't spoken to her since their last argument at a fair in Philadelphia, that he didn't know where the sword was, that he just wanted it back, nothing more. Hale did not intervene. He just registered every word, every pause, every subtle contradiction. He asked about her location the night Kendra disappeared. Maria stated that she had been in Cleveland at a private auction. The event had no electronic credentialing system. There were no cameras in the hallways, nor were there reliable witnesses who could pinpoint her location all night. Only one person claimed to have seen her a couple of hours before midnight. The alibi, in principle, did not hold up, but a series of digital transactions ended up closing the loophole. Maria had made 3 minor purchases from her phone in different parts of the city between 11 o'clock at night and 1 o'clock in the morning. The payment confirmations matched the forensic estimates. It was unlikely that he had traveled to Wexford, committed the murder, and returned without trace. Hale accepted the possibility. He ruled her out as a direct perpetrator, but not as part of the environment that pressured Kendra before her death. Maria's tone changed toward the end, less aggressive, less defiant, as if the wear and tear of the interrogation was beginning to open up other spaces. Hale didn't mention anyone else, but she did. She did so without being asked. She said there was a man, someone who had been hanging around Kendra for months. He wasn't part of the collector's circle. He wasn't an exhibitor. He didn't sell anything. He wasn't buying anything. He was just there. At every event, on every corner, a few feet away. He didn't remember his last name, only his first name, Jude. He said Kendra used to get upset when she saw him, that she avoided him, that she changed her route so as not to cross him, that at some point she even asked him for help to get rid of him, although she never formally denounced him. Maria did not know if they had had any kind of bond. She only knew that he was always there, observing, without intervening, without speaking, as if he was waiting for something. For Hale, that information changed the direction of the case. It was no longer a dispute between rivals. It was no longer just a missing collectible. There was someone else. Someone who wasn't in the records. Someone who moved in the shadows. someone who, until that moment, no one had mentioned. The interrogation ended without confession. No direct evidence, but it left more than a suspect. It left a crack, a new name, a new address. And Hale, who didn't believe in coincidences, knew that real danger often lies where no one is looking. The forensic report arrived a week after the discovery. The analysis was precise, meticulous, cold. Kendra's skull showed unusual internal fractures. The base of the occipital bone had yielded inward, as if an expansive force had pressed outward from the oral cavity. It was not a simple blow, nor was it a fall. The type of injury was unusual. The shape of the trauma did not match any everyday object. The fracture pattern was symmetrical, mechanical, progressive. That's what alerted the forensic team. After comparison with forensic trauma databases and historical tools, a conclusion was reached. The murder weapon had been a medieval torture instrument. Its name, the Pear of Anguish, a macabre object, rare, with documented origin in Europe during the 16th century. It was inserted into the mouth with the leaves closed like a metallic flower. Once inside, it expanded through a screw mechanism. It broke jaws, tore palates, shattered the internal cavity of the mouth, and in many cases caused death by shock or hemorrhage. Its use was intended to punish, not just to silence, and in this case, it had served that purpose. It was not an easy weapon to obtain. There were no common replicas. It was not sold in stores. It was not part of a costume. Its possession required access to private collections or to the dark market of historical instruments. Whoever used it not only knew what it did, they also knew what it meant. It was not an improvised tool. It was a choice, careful, personal. For Hale, the finding changed the focus of the case. Kendra's murder was not an act of impulse. It was not the result of a fight. It was a ritual, a deliberate execution, loaded with symbolism, connected to the world the victim inhabited, but from a darker, more obsessive angle. The killer didn't just kill her. He punished her, with an object associated with humiliation, control, and meticulous pain, as if he wanted to silence her from the inside, as if her death needed something more than disappearance. Forensics confirmed that the pear had not been left in place. It was removed after the act. The killer not only brought it with him, he also took it with him. That decision was not accidental. The object had value, symbolic value, or emotional, perhaps both. Hale requested a cross-check of known inventories of medieval props, private museums, and closed collections. He found no immediate results, but he knew that someone in Kendra's entourage must have known about such pieces. He wasn't just an ordinary collector. He was someone who crossed the line between hobby and obsession. The forensic report also revealed another detail. There were no other injuries. There were no signs of immobilization or resistance. That suggested that Kendra had not been attacked by surprise, but subdued quickly, possibly drugged or tricked. There was no struggle. There were no traces of defense, just silence, and then death. The weapon said it all. This was no ordinary crime. It was an act of dominance. And Hale knew that someone who is capable of using something like that doesn't do it on impulse. They do it out of conviction. The name had appeared on Maria Bellamy's lips, not as an accusation, but as a warning. She said it at the end disdainfully, as one who casts a shadow. A man named Jude, who was always near Kendra, silent, persistent, not quite belonging to the group, but never wandering away. Hale asked the intelligence team to track attendance records, convention footage, and security camera videos from the past few months. At least 6 separate events, Jude's face appeared. Never in the foreground, always in the background, at the back of the aisles, walking behind the crowd, observing the booths, the objects, the costumes. He never spoke. He never interacted with the organizers. He was not registered as an exhibitor or official buyer, but he was there. He was located a week later in a discreet hotel on the outskirts of Wexford. He had booked under a different name, but his face had not changed. The pattern of his movements gave him away. Hale summoned him to testify at an auxiliary county office, unannounced. He didn't want to do it at the police station. Sometimes the setting determines the tone of a conversation, and this conversation needed to be quiet. Jude was in his early 50s, elegant, reserved. He did not seem intimidated by the process. His accent was slight but marked a distinct upbringing. He introduced himself naturally. He handed over his passport, his documentation. He claimed to represent a private group of European collectors interested in authentic film props. He did not have a registered company in the country. He traveled frequently. He bought, negotiated, evaluated objects for a consortium with no fixed headquarters. He offered no further details. Hale didn't ask for them. Not yet. During cross-examination, his account was firm. He confirmed that he had attended the private auction in Cleveland. He said he had tried to buy the sword. He knew it was one of the originals used in the Crimson Citadel. He confirmed that he had contacted Kendra weeks before the event to express interest. The sale never materialized. He stated that she was ambivalent. She neither accepted nor declined the offer, she just procrastinated. Then she disappeared. He denied having physical contact with Kendra. He said they never spoke face-to-face, only a brief exchange by mail, nothing more. He didn't know where she lived, he did not know her circle. He claimed his interest was professional. That, as a representative of the group, he offered substantial sums for unique objects. The sword was one of them. Hale listened without interrupting. He took note of what was not said, the absence of emotion, the precision of detail, the lack of surprise at learning of Kendra's death, as if he already knew. As if it didn't surprise him at all, the alibi was solid, at least in appearance. The passport had recent stamps. Entry into the country had been recorded a week before Kendra's death. His movements were geolocated through his phone and cards. She had remained in Cleveland for the entire week of the event. His records matched the auction times. Hotel cameras placed him coming and going at regular intervals. There was no evidence placing him in Wexford during the time window of the murder. But Hale wasn't looking for proof yet, he was looking for motive. And Jude, despite his impeccable facade, had one. When asked directly about the sword, he avoided generalities. He confirmed that he knew of its value, not only economic, cultural. He said his group considered that piece part of the heritage of film history, that it should be in the right hands. He did not refer to possession, he spoke of custody, of responsibility, as if it were a sacred object. That word was the first crack. Hale noted the term, custody. It was not common among dealers, not even among collectors. It was the language of those who believe an object represents something else, not merchandise. Meaning. Jude's tone never changed, not a crack, but his words revealed a deeper tension. He didn't talk about missing an opportunity. He spoke of losing his footing, as if Kendra's holding the sword destabilized anything, as if what mattered was not her but what she possessed, and what she represented. No trace of his presence was found in Kendra's apartment. He left no footprints. He sent no messages. There was no record of direct communication beyond the first contact for the offer. But to Hale, that wasn't proof of innocence. It was skill, planned silence. At the end of the interrogation, Hale had no evidence to stop him. But he did have something more valuable, intuition. Jude was not an impulsive criminal. If he had anything to do with it, he didn't act alone. And he didn't do it for money. He did it out of loyalty to something greater, to an idea, to an invisible structure where certain objects are not bought. They are protected, and where those who don't understand it disappear. Hale did not close the file. He asked to continue tracing international connections, accounts, shipments, movements of similar pieces. He knew Jude wasn't lying, but he wasn't telling the whole truth either. In that world, what is hidden is not always behind a mask. Sometimes it's hidden behind a shared obsession. The case was expanding, and Hale, who never trusted coincidences, already knew which direction to go. Jason Holt's name did not appear in the first days of investigation. His face was known in the circuit, but without scandal or public conflict. He had participated in FantasyCon for years as an exhibitor and historical reenactor. He specialized in medieval weaponry, authentic costumes, and period torture reenactments. Hale didn't have him on the suspect list until he crossed a tip, the sword. An anonymous source at the event mentioned that, according to ancient rumors, the sword Kendra possessed had not been purchased. It had been given to her as a gift, and the one who had given it to her had been her ex-partner, Jason Holt. That piece of information changed everything. Jason was 42 years old. He lived alone in a rural house on the outskirts of town. His workshop occupied half of the property. In it, he made replicas of weapons, shields, shackles, and torture devices. Some pieces were for display, others functional. He had worked as a consultant for historical films. His knowledge was not only technical, it was visceral. He understood the weight, the sound, the texture of each object. But he was not just an expert. He was a devotee of the past. He was summoned to testify without resistance. He presented himself with serenity, even courtesy. His presence was calm, his tone low. He did not appear uncomfortable or surprised. He said he knew Kendra, that they had been on and off romantically for almost 2 years, that they had met at a past fantasy con. They shared interests, they shared aesthetics, they shared comfortable silences, according to him. During their time together, he gave her several pieces as gifts. One of them was the sword. He said that he himself had designed the replica, based on documentation of the filming and elements of the saga's mythology. For him, it was not just another sword. It was an extension of himself. When he gave it to Kendra, he said, he did so as a symbolic act. It wasn't a purchase or a loan. It was a gesture, a symbol of trust, of belonging, of bonding. But over time, the relationship deteriorated. Kendra pulled away. She distanced herself. She changed her surroundings. She stopped responding to his messages. She shut down. Jason said there was no conflict, just distance. But Hale noticed the gestures behind his words. A brief pause at the mention of the end of the relationship. A slight contraction in his jaw at the mention of the sword's name. He said he didn't know if she still had it, that he hadn't seen her for months, that he didn't go looking for it. But he didn't quite manage to hide the resentment. In his statement, he insisted that the object no longer belonged to him. But his words revealed something else. To Jason, the sword was not just a gift. It was a symbol of something that was broken without his consent. It didn't bother him that Kendra had the sword. He was hurt that she decided to part with everything it represented without looking back. That was the wound, the silent betrayal. He had no solid alibi. He said he was working alone in his workshop that night. No witnesses, no records. He didn't use a geolocation phone. He had no security cameras, just tools, iron and wood. When Hale asked him if he had known about Kendra's death before he was subpoenaed, Jason said yes, that he had seen it on networks, that he was sorry. He didn't cry. He didn't look away, but he didn't show real surprise either. In the forensic file, there was one more piece of information, still undisclosed. The pair of anguish used as a murder weapon was an authentic model, rare, preserved in few collections, a functional piece, not decorative. Analysis determined it was not a cheap replica. It was a restored original, and one of the few people with the technical knowledge and access to such an object, according to records, was Jason Holt. The gun was not found on his property. There were no physical traces connecting him to the scene. There were no prints. There was no DNA, just a void. But Hale knew how to read voids. And in that one, he found the shadow of something more than jealousy or abandonment. He found a punishment, a way to mark the end of a story where only one of the two accepted that it was over. Jason left the room without handcuffs, no charges. But he left behind a thick silence, one that no longer needed words for suspicion. Donovan Hale didn't believe in alibis without witnesses, nor in well-spoken words without weight behind them. There was something about Jason Holt that didn't add up. His demeanor was neat, his story accurate, but that accuracy was precisely the problem. No one is so controlled when talking about the death of someone they loved. No one is as whole at the memory of a betrayal unless they feel no guilt, or have already done something with it. Hale asked for discreet surveillance. He assigned 2 unmarked patrols to follow Holt for the next few days. He didn't want confrontation. He wanted to observe. Wait for the mistake, because in his experience, he who thinks he has gained the upper hand often relaxes. And that's when the truth begins to leak out. On the 3rd day, just before dawn, Jason Holt left his property. He did not use his usual vehicle. He took an old pickup truck that he kept stored behind the workshop. He had with him a wooden box, a canvas backpack, and a shovel. The engine sounded muffled, as if he hadn't started it in months. Hale, who was already en route, didn't need any more signals. They followed him to a dense forest on the outskirts of the county, an area used by hikers but deserted at that hour. Holt drove down a dirt road, then turned off, crossed an area of closed trees, and stopped in a clearing barely visible from the main trail. There, he began to work. He took out what he had brought. He lit a makeshift fire and began to burn things. The surveillance team did not intervene immediately. Hale watched from a distance. He saw it throw pieces of leather, metal plates, fragments of reinforced fabric, armor, then something else, a metal object in the shape of a closed flower, with a screw mechanism in the center. The pair of anguish. He threw it into the fire without hesitation. He watched it burn. He destroyed it with method, not with desperation, but with conviction. He knew what he was doing. He was erasing its history, piece by piece. But there was one thing he failed to destroy. Inside the box was a dark cloth, carefully wrapped. When he opened it, the sword appeared, the same one he had once designed and delivered as a symbol of union. He did not throw it into the fire, he tried to bury it, but the ground was damp. The earth was soft. The leaf was sticking out. He tried to cover it with branches. It wasn't enough. At that moment, Hale intervened. There was no persecution, there was no resistance. Jason looked at him as if he already knew it was all over. He was wordlessly handcuffed. On the ride to the police station, he did not speak. But in the interrogation room, when he was presented with the evidence recovered from the fire, the silence was broken. The sword had not been destroyed. It was blackened but whole. On the hilt, under the scorched leather, were traces of blood. Not Kendra's, but Jason's. Blood that had mixed with the blade during the attack. In addition, fragments of his armor were found among the ashes in the clearing. A piece of the shoulder pad, with remnants of a handcrafted engraving. It matched an image of him taken during the last edition of FantasyCon. The reconstruction of the crime was accurate. Jason subpoenaed Kendra at an intermediate point, using an ambiguous message. He didn't struggle. He didn't force her. She came thinking there was still a part of him that wanted closure with respect. Maybe she even thought she was coming to get the sword back. But Jason didn't want it back, he wanted to punish her. According to his confession, the act was premeditated. Not out of hatred, but out of what he considered a profound betrayal. He said the sword was not just an object, it was a promise, a symbol of true love. Giving it to her had been his way of merging with her, of belonging to something greater. When he learned Kendra planned to sell it, something snapped. For Jason, it wasn't a transaction, it was an offense, a complete disregard for what they had shared. The idea of punishment did not come immediately. It came slowly, like an ancient echo. He justified the use of the pair of anguish as a living metaphor, a tool that he believed represented enforced silence, the necessary end. He did not say it with cruelty. He said it with devotion, as one who performs a ritual act, like someone who believes he is restoring a lost moral balance. Hale listened to everything without interrupting. It was not the first time he had seen a murderer talk calmly about his crime, but it was the first time he had heard someone wrap it up in a logic of sacred fidelity. Jason Holt was formally arraigned. The sword was secured as evidence. The case was closed, at least in legal terms. But for Hale, there was a part that could not be closed. The crime wasn't just an emotional reaction. It was a performance, a play constructed with symbols, with objects, with silences. Jason didn't kill out of jealousy. He killed out of ideology, for a distorted vision of love, of legacy, of what it means to belong to someone else. Kendra's tragedy wasn't just being killed. It was becoming a character in a story she didn't choose to play. And for Hale, that was the darkest thing of all. Case 4. The 911 call came in at 2:43 in the morning. A trembling male voice could barely articulate the words. He said he heard gunshots. One house over, lights came on in the darkness of a sleepy neighborhood, and then silence. When the first patrolman arrived at the property, a modest white-fronted home in a residential area on the outskirts of Wilmington, North Carolina, the front door was ajar. The alarm still sounded, muffled and persistent. The interior dark. The kitchen lit by the ajar refrigerator. There, on the tiled floor, the agents found two bodies, that of an adult woman, slumped on her left side, and that of a minor a few centimeters away from her. There was blood, a lot of it. On the floor, on the counter, splattered on the wall. A fallen chair, the oven door open, the sour smell of an abandoned stew. Everything indicated there had been a fight, a short struggle, violent. The wounds were gunshot wounds. The woman, later identified as 37-year-old Danielle Brooks, was dead at the scene. Her daughter, 12-year-old Lucy Brooks, was still breathing faintly. She was rushed to the nearest hospital in critical condition. She had a wound to her abdomen, another to her thigh. The prognosis was uncertain. At the scene, the details spoke louder than the victims. A bullet embedded in a phone book on the table, as if it had been fired with no clear direction. A pink cell phone broken with a splintered casing. In the center of the pool of blood, a small, round, red gem, barely the size of a lentil. It appeared to be detached from the phone. An identical one was missing from the top edge of the phone. A back door had been forced open. The lock hung broken, barely held by one of the screws. The marks on the frame were fresh. Someone had entered through the back of the house. without permission, without discretion. In the family vehicle parked in the driveway, a firearm was found in the glove compartment. It had fresh gunshot residue and a partially empty barrel. Next to it, an open cartridge box and 3 shell casings scattered on the driver's seat carpet. The first expert report ruled out robbery. No money or valuables were missing. The television was still on. The wallets were intact. The laptop on the sofa. Everything indicated that the target was not material. What had happened in that kitchen was not an impromptu assault. It was personal, and it had gotten out of control. Danielle Brooks did not die instantly. The shot entered the left temple at an upward angle. The bullet passed through the skull and caused a massive cerebral hemorrhage. It was a lethal wound, but not a fatal one. The body fell slowly. Blood formed a spiral pattern along the edge of the countertop, staining the tiles and the base of a fallen chair. According to the coroner, the victim was conscious for a few seconds after being shot, enough to know what was happening. On his right cheek was a fresh bruise. The broken skin and the sunken bone indicated a blunt, directed paramortem blow. The impact was consistent with the butt of a gun or the end of a pistol held tightly. It was a deliberate assault. Whoever struck her did so not to silence her, but to subdue her before killing her. In the forensic room, Detective Donovan Hale reviewed the images without blinking. He knew a crime of passion when he saw one. And this wasn't just any crime of passion. There was no chaos here, but direction. Every element of the scene, the pool of blood, the broken pink phone, the bullet embedded in the phone book, was part of a controlled sequence. It was not a random attack, it was intimate. Hale, 56, a specialist in domestic crimes and silent profiling, joined the case after the first technical analysis. He was a man of routine, of few words and many silences. He carried a notebook, not a tape recorder. He never interrupted. He preferred to observe the language of the bodies rather than that of the statements. He did not believe in what people said, only in what they tried to hide. Requested home emergency history. 4 calls in 3 months, domestic disturbances, audible arguments from the street, no formal complaint, no legal action. Officers found only evasions, accidental falls, doors improperly closed, televisions on high volume, empty phrases to cover up fear. There were unanswered messages on Danielle's personal phone. Some were auto-replies, others were drafts never sent. One in particular spoke of the possibility of leaving. "I'm looking for something to get out. I can't go on like this." Another mentioned her daughter directly. "Lucy doesn't deserve to grow up with this." Nothing had been sent. Everything had been put on hold. The house from the outside looked normal. Tidy interior, common kitchen, everyday items in place. But Hale knew those were the most dangerous scenarios, where the normal disguises the inevitable. The night of the crime, Lucy was shot twice. One in the leg, another in the abdomen. She still survived. Her testimony, if she recovered, would be crucial. But for now, the silence was total. All Hale had were the objects, and those didn't lie. The shattered pink cell phone had belonged to Lucy. A small decorative gem was missing from the casing. An identical one appeared in the middle of the pool of blood, right next to Danielle's body. The phone had been smashed, not broken by accident. A firm footfall with intent, as if someone didn't want that device to keep working. The back door was broken in, but the entry was not rushed. The marks were fresh, but the interior showed no urgency. Nothing had been stolen. Everything was in its place. The television was on, the wallets untouched. Hale knew what that meant. This wasn't a botched robbery. This was someone who came in with a single purpose: to impose something, to shut someone up, to leave a mark. In the family vehicle, a semi-automatic pistol, traces of gunpowder, spent casings, and an incomplete box of ammunition. The gun had been fired recently. It was not registered to any of the residents. But Hale had already ordered the trace. The truth was close. All that remained was for someone to make the mistake of not wiping their prints clean. Danielle Brooks did not die by accident. Her body showed ancient fear. Her face, futile resistance. And Hale knew the killer didn't just know the house. He knew every emotional corner of that family. Fourth interrogation. Simon Brooks. 5 days had passed since the crime. The investigation was progressing among forensic reports, phone analysis, and partial clues. But there was one absence impossible to ignore. Simon Brooks, the victim's husband, was nowhere to be found. His number was off. He had not returned to work. He hadn't contacted family members. He hadn't even shown up at the hospital where his daughter was still in serious condition. To Donovan Hale, that was more than suspicious. It was a runaway, and those who run away do it out of fear or guilt. He was located at dusk on the 6th day, in a cheap motel on the edge of the highway under a different name. He had used an old ID, issued in a different state. The desk clerk said he was barely out of the room. He had paid cash. He was traveling alone, with no luggage, and had with him a semi-automatic pistol, stowed under the car seat, with 3 spent casings in the glove compartment. Preliminary analysis confirmed the obvious. The gun had been fired recently. His hands showed traces of gunpowder. He had not tried to hide it, nor did he explain it. He was brought into the interrogation room without handcuffs. Hale wanted to observe how he behaved without the visible weight of the accusation. Simon was about 45 years old. Dull face, tense jaw, wrinkled clothes. He didn't ask about his daughter. He didn't mention his wife. He only asked for a glass of water, which he did not touch. He said he did not kill anyone, that he had fled out of fear, that when he got home and saw the scene, he panicked, that he did not know what to do, that he didn't want to call the police for fear they wouldn't believe him. Hale let him talk. He didn't interrupt. He let him wear himself out with his own version. But the records told a different story. Simon had not been home that night. His movements placed him out of state during the day of the crime, but there was a gap of nearly 10 hours between his departure from the hotel and his final location. Enough time to return, commit the crime, and return. However, his gun, although fired, did not match ballistically with the projectiles recovered at the scene. It was a different piece. The caliber was not the same. Technically, it was not the murder weapon, but it was still a gun fired in recent days. And in his record, that was not a minor detail. When Hale requested a thorough verification of his documents, what turned up was a second life. Simon Brooks was not his real name. His original identity was Victor Daniels. He had legally changed his name 14 years earlier, after plea bargaining his way out of an inconclusive investigation in Colorado. The charge: prime suspect in the death of Nathan Peterson, alleged lover of his first wife. Peterson had disappeared without a trace. Victor, then with no criminal record, claimed to have had no relationship with him. But there was a restraining order in place, and a history of domestic violence sealed by the courts. The case was closed for lack of evidence. 6 months later, Victor Daniels disappeared. In his place, Simon Brooks was born with a new address, new driver's license, and new story. During the interrogation, Hale confronted Simon with this data. His attitude changed. He went from exhaustion to resignation. He didn't try to deny it. He said he had put it all behind him, that he just wanted to start over, that Danielle never knew the full story, but that he suspected, that the pressure of the last few months had made him paranoid, that he thought she might find out everything. Hale was not interested in justification. He wanted the truth that had not yet been told. With his eyes fixed on the ground, Simon spoke about Nathan. He said it had been a mistake, that on that night 12 years ago an argument had broken out, that he confronted him, that he followed him to an isolated stretch of road in the desert, that he didn't intend to kill him, but she did. She beat him until he stopped moving, dragged him into a natural ditch, covered him with rocks and dirt, and left. He never came back, he never looked for it. He just changed his life. He confessed to the murder of Nathan Peterson without drama, as if he was talking about someone who no longer existed, including himself. But in Danielle's case, he was adamant. He said it wasn't him, that he hadn't broken into the house, that he hadn't shot, that he had loved her even when everything was breaking down, that he couldn't face the fear of being accused again, that when he saw the crime, he thought that everything would be repeated, and that's why he fled. Hale knew the motive existed. The fear of exposure, the pent-up tension, the recent arguments, the threats, some documented, some mentioned by witnesses. There was a history, yes, and a repeating pattern. But he also knew that the evidence did not tie him to the shooting. The gun didn't match. The blood on his clothes wasn't Danielle's or Lucy's. The exact time of the crime didn't quite fit with his displacement. It could not be proven, irrefutably, that he was in the house at the time. However, I had it for another death, an older one that no one had closed. The Nathan Peterson case was reopened, the confession signed, the coordinates of the burial noted on a makeshift map. Teams were sent to the indicated area, and there it was, what was left of a body forgotten by justice and buried by guilt. Simon Brooks, or rather Victor Daniels, was charged with Peterson's murder and taken into federal custody. For Hale, that did not close Danielle's case, but it offered a different certainty. Sometimes past crimes find their punishment, even if it is through the mirror of a new one. He had yet to find out who pulled the trigger that night in the kitchen. But one thing was clear. The monster Danielle feared existed. It just wasn't the one who did the shooting. Not that time. The confession of Simon Brooks, whose real name was Victor Daniels, closed one door and opened another. Admitting that he had killed Nathan Peterson and buried his body in the desert solved a case forgotten by the system, but it left open a more immediate question. If Simon didn't kill Danielle, who did? Ethan Peterson's name first appeared 2 days after the confession. Hale's digital analysis team was tracking suspicious messages around Danielle. One of them, an email with direct threats, had been sent from an anonymous account weeks before the murder. Its content was clear, direct, and most disturbing, specific. It included phrases such as, "You're going to pay for what you did," and "Death is little for what you deserve." Initially, it was thought that the message was addressed to Danielle, but after Simon's confession, the meaning changed. The target had been him, Nathan's killer. The IP address on the mailing led to a private home on the outskirts of Raleigh. Emma Peterson, Nathan's sister, lived there. Upon searching her home and devices connected to her Wi-Fi network, the tech crime team confirmed that the emails had been sent from her laptop, at times when Emma was not at home. Emma denied any involvement. She said she regularly lent her home to her nephew Ethan, son of Nathan Peterson, who was in a halfway house after serving a juvenile sentence for a misdemeanor. Ethan was 22 years old. He lived in a community residence supervised by social workers. He went out only on weekends. Emma, moved by his story, let him stay at her house occasionally. Donovan Hale ordered it located. It didn't take long to find him. He was summoned to testify in an office of the Reinsertion Center. He arrived accompanied by a paralegal and his social worker. He had a thin build, a sunken gaze, and a defensive attitude from the first minute. Hale didn't press. He just watched. Ethan admitted to sending the emails. He said he had been investigating the whereabouts of Simon Brooks for years, convinced he had killed his father. He had gathered public information, scoured social networks, bought leaked reports on underground forums. He knew the new name. He knew where he lived. He knew what he did for a living. But, he said, he never had the courage or the opportunity to confront him. He said the threats were just an escape valve, that he didn't plan to carry them out, that he never set foot in Wexford, that on the night of the murder he was at the residence, going about his nightly routine, that the facility's surveillance system could prove it. Hale requested the recordings from that night. The center's system used low-quality cameras, but the records were clear. Ethan was captured at 10:03 p.m. in the common dining room, then at 11:47 p.m. in the hallway on his way to his room. At 2:36 a.m., the approximate time of the shooting, there was no activity recorded. But his door was never opened. His exit, at least through the official entrances, did not occur. The alibi seemed solid, but it was not foolproof. The emails contained detailed threats. The emotional and obsessive language revealed more than resentment. It revealed planning. Ethan had personal knowledge of Simon's routine, places he frequented, family events. He even referred to Danielle by name, and that got Hale's attention. If the hatred was for Victor Daniels, why focus on the wife? Ethan said he just wanted to scare him, that Simon deserved to live in fear, that he never intended to harm anyone else. But the words didn't match the intensity of his language. In the messages were graphic descriptions, death scenarios, indirect threats toward people close to Simon. And though he denied ever setting foot in the Brooks house, Hale wasn't convinced. The forensic examination of his clothing, vehicle, and personal effects did not yield conclusive results. No traces of gunpowder, no traces of blood, and no physical elements directly linking him to the crime scene were found. His criminal record, although marked by episodes of rage, did not place him as a prepared killer. But rancor, Hale thought, has ways of reinventing itself. Emma Peterson was also questioned. She said she never knew that her nephew had discovered the truth about his father. She believed the years had helped him overcome the trauma. She admitted that Ethan had changed. He became more closed off, more obsessive. He spent hours in front of the computer. Sometimes he didn't eat. He went through old files. He listened to recordings. One night he heard him mutter, "Everything comes back." Everything. The most revealing technical evidence came from the metadata of one of the threatening emails. Although the IP was the same, an internal code fragment, inserted by mistake when copying and pasting text from another source, corresponded to a different laptop. A specific model purchased 6 months ago for cash at a thrift store. That model was found under Ethan's bed, hidden in a shoebox. Inside were documents not only about Simon, but about Danielle. Photos taken from outside the house, check-in and check-out times, even a file titled Alternate Scenario. It was not enough evidence for an indictment, but it was enough to know that Ethan had contemplated something else. Even without physical evidence at the crime scene, Hale left the door open. The crime was still without a direct perpetrator, but now the circle had narrowed. A collateral victim, an injured daughter, a father with a bloody past, and a young man who grew up with the certainty that his father's murderer was living at large, forming a new family. Sometimes, Hale thought, crimes are not born at the moment of the shooting. They are born many years before, in the silence, in the unheeded rage, in the echo of pain passed down from one generation to the next. And the worst part was knowing that, in this case, the echo was not yet over. The hospital waiting room was dark, illuminated only by the dim light of the wall sconces. In one of the chairs, Valerie Knox sat, her gaze fixed on the door to Lucy Brooks' room. Since the girl's admission, Valerie had not left her side, showing a dedication that at first seemed that of a concerned friend. However, to Detective Donovan Hale, that devotion had overtones that went beyond simple friendship. Hale had noticed how Valerie took on responsibilities that belonged to immediate family members, coordinating with doctors, making decisions about Lucy's care, and spending nights at the hospital. Her constant presence and protective attitude made Hale uneasy. He decided it was time to delve deeper into the relationship between Valerie and the Brooks family. Digging into the past, Hale discovered that Valerie and Danielle Brooks had been close friends since they were teenagers. In recent years, however, their bond had evolved in a peculiar way. Valerie, single and childless, had become a central figure in Danielle and Lucy's lives, becoming involved in ways that transcended conventional friendship. During questioning, Valerie maintained an initial composure, describing her relationship with Danielle as one of deep friendship and her closeness with Lucy as that of a caring aunt. However, when addressing topics related to Danielle's personal life and future plans, Valerie showed signs of discomfort. Her voice trembled slightly at the mention that Danielle had considered moving in with Lucy to start over, a decision that Valerie felt would have been detrimental to the girl. Hale sensed in Valerie a preoccupation bordering on obsession. Her attachment to Lucy and her resistance to the idea of Danielle walking away suggested an intense emotional dependence. Digging deeper into this aspect, Valerie finally admitted that she felt a deep love for Danielle, beyond friendship. She confessed that these feelings had led her to act impulsively and make decisions she now regretted. The investigation revealed that Valerie had been at the Brooks home the night of the murder. Street security cameras captured her vehicle parked near the residence at times close to the crime. In addition, messages were found on her phone addressed to Danielle, some never sent, expressing frustration and grief at feeling left out of her future plans. Confronted with this evidence, Valerie broke down. Between sobs, she confessed that she had confronted Danielle that night, desperate to dissuade her from her decision to move. The argument escalated, and in a fit of anger and desperation, Valerie grabbed the gun Simon kept in the house and fired. She had no intention of hurting Lucy. Her target was Danielle, but in the chaos, the situation got out of control. Valerie's confession brought clarity to the case, although it left a trail of pain and unanswered questions. Detective Hale reflected on the complexities of human relationships and how love, in its various forms, can lead to unimaginable actions. The Brooks case revealed not only a crime of passion, but also the depths of the human psyche and the consequences of unrequited feelings. For weeks, the case had swung between half-truths and fragmented leads. The death of Danielle Brooks and the hospitalization of her daughter Lucy had revealed deep layers of secrets, crossed relationships, and open wounds. The confession of Simon Brooks, now confirmed as Victor Daniels, had solved an old crime, but not the one that now consumed the Wexford community. There was a missing piece, and that piece appeared in the least expected form. Emma Peterson had gone unnoticed at the beginning. She was, on the surface, just Ethan Peterson's aunt, a peripheral figure. But in Hale's investigation, the fringes were always the most dangerous. A flash caught on a cell phone camera, Lucy's pink phone became the crack that let the truth through. A reflection of light, a barely visible figure. It was not a photo, but a screen activation. A fragment of image automatically uploaded to the cloud, just enough to arouse suspicion. Hale went back to looking at everything from the beginning. Emma had been steady, yes, but silent. Too informed about Simon. Too affected by the past. All it took was a few cross-examination questions, a log of recent movements, and a digital inspection of her home to trace the connection. Unsent emails, documents about her brother Nathan's case, saved images of Danielle and Simon. She had it all. When she was summoned to testify, she did not deny her presence in the house. She did not try to construct an alibi. She sat in front of Hale like someone who has been waiting to be heard for years. Her confession was slow, without anger, but with unshakable conviction. He had watched the Brooks house for weeks. He knew the schedules, the open windows, the nightly habits. His goal was clear: to confront Simon, the man who in her mind and memory had destroyed her family, erased her brother's name, and escaped justice. She wanted to look him in the eye. She wanted justice, but Simon was not there that night. He entered through the back door, expecting to find him. She was carrying an antique pistol, not just any gun, but the same one that belonged to Nathan, which she had retrieved from the back of a locked cabinet more than a decade ago. It was a symbolic, personal act. It was not just any gun, it was part of the past. What he found in the kitchen was not the killer. It was Danielle and her daughter Lucy. The initial confusion gave way to a tense exchange. Danielle tried to protect her daughter, to demand answers, to expel the intruder. The argument turned into a struggle. Emma shouted, Danielle shouted back. Lucy tried to intervene. Amid the chaos, the gun went off, once, then another. Danielle fell. Lucy screamed. The scene fell apart. Emma said she didn't know what to do. She hadn't planned for that. She hadn't imagined a confrontation with innocence, but the gun had already spoken, and everything broke. He thought Lucy had taken a picture with her cell phone. He had seen the flash, didn't know if it was a camera shot or an automatic activation. On instinct, he snatched it up, destroyed it, threw it near the door before running away. It was a reflex action, like everything else. Subsequent ballistic analysis confirmed it. The weapon used was the same one that had been involved 12 years earlier in a botched robbery, where Nathan Peterson, her brother, had acted as an armed lookout. The bullet embedded in the countertop, the one that hit Danielle, matched one from that case. The story had closed in on itself. Emma was formally arrested and taken into custody. She did not resist. She did not ask for a lawyer at first. She said only one sentence before she was transferred. I didn't want to kill her, but someone had to pay. The subsequent trial was not straightforward. The defense appealed to a combination of unresolved trauma, emotional imbalance, and the psychological pressure of living years without answers. The prosecutor argued that the obsession, prolonged stalking, and premeditated act demonstrated full consciousness. The court was to decide between crime of passion or deliberate murder, but that would be sometime later. In the present, Hale knew the case had left a scar impossible to ignore. Danielle, a mother seeking to break free. Lucy, a child scarred by violence, unknowingly bearing the ultimate image. Simon, a man who had escaped for years from a crime and who, even without having pulled the trigger this time, had sown the chain of consequences. And Emma, a random face among the attendees of the tragedy, with the oldest wound of all. The resolution of the case was clear but not clean. There was no satisfaction, only closure. And closure, for Hale, had never been synonymous with peace. Emma Peterson's trial began 3 months after her arrest. The prosecution presented a strong case, supported by forensic evidence, ballistic analysis, digital records, and above all, her own confession. The defense, for its part, built a strategy based on progressive emotional deterioration, arguing that Emma had acted under a combination of complex trauma, untreated post-traumatic stress disorder, and an altered perception of justice. The court was presided over by Judge Alan Drexler, known for his firmness in cases of domestic violence and crimes derived from family trauma. From the outset, he established a rigorous and neutral process, mindful of the media impact of the case and the sensitivity of the facts. During the hearings, the prosecution focused on proving that Emma had acted with premeditation. Prior monitoring of the Brooks family, systematic surveillance of the home, searches of her vehicle in the vicinity, and documents saved on her laptop containing schedules, diagrams, and a file entitled when justice is done, were presented. Although there was no explicit planning for murder, the elements suggested direct confrontational intent, with knowledge of the risk. The murder weapon, an antique pistol owned by his deceased brother, was a key point in the trial. The prosecution interpreted it as a symbol of personal justice, loaded with meaning. The defense argued the opposite, an object from the past that pushed her emotionally over the edge, reliving everything unresolved. Emma was cooperative throughout the process. She did not retract her confession. She did not seek to minimize her responsibility. In her statement to the court, she did not ask for leniency. She acknowledged her guilt, but also her pain. He said that he did not wish to kill Danielle, that he could not control what happened at that moment, that he had been waiting for too many years for something that never came. One of the most sensitive moments of the trial was the reading of the medical testimony about Lucy Brooks. The girl had survived, but with permanent physical consequences. Her statements were taken behind closed doors and read by a legal representative. In them, Lucy spoke of fear, of confusion, of seeing her mother fall. Although Emma was not charged with attempted murder against the child, for lack of clear evidence of intent, the court considered the harm as an aggravating factor in sentencing. After 13 days of hearings, the jury found Emma Peterson guilty of second-degree murder with aggravated trespassing and unlawful possession of a firearm. The charge of premeditated murder was dismissed, finding that there was no specific planning for the crime itself, but rather a confrontation that got out of control. The judge handed down a sentence of 25 years of effective imprisonment, with no possibility of parole before the first 18 years. He considered Emma's clean record, her full cooperation, and the attenuated nature of the motive, but also emphasized the responsibility of her actions, the violence of the outcome, and the irreversible damage caused to a minor. Emma listened to the sentence without getting upset. She did not cry. She did not speak. She was removed from the courtroom in silence. For Hale, who watched each session from the back of the courtroom, justice did not bring peace, but it did bring order. There were no victors. Only a clear line drawn on a history laden with omissions, revenge, losses, and silences. And sometimes he thought, that was all the law could offer, a structure to contain the chaos, even if it could not repair what was broken.